This is Judaism Unbound, episode 74, Beyond Jewish Identity. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Levinson.
And I'm Lex Rofus.
And our guest today is Ari Kelman. He is the Jim Joseph Professor of Education and Jewish Studies in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. Ari directs the concentration on education and Jewish studies at Stanford, and he is one of the foremost academic researchers studying contemporary Jewish identity in America today. Ari, we are so thrilled to welcome you to Judaism Unbound to get a sense from you of how we should be thinking about Jews today.
I'm glad to be here.
So you do a lot of studies of Jews, and I thought as a way of just getting started, it would be helpful for you to share with our listeners what are the right questions to ask, what are the wrong questions to ask, what should we be thinking about whenever we read and the various studies that come out or think about how better studies might be done. Give us a little bit of a landscape of how we even start to think about what's up with Jews.
It's a really hard question, actually. I suppose if I knew the answer to that question, my job would be a lot easier. I think the best studies that I've done are fairly narrow in scope. We're trying to figure out one thing as opposed to trying to answer all the questions of like, what are Jews or how do they existentially make sense of the lives that they live? Those are big and murky and often end up with a mess of data that are not that helpful. But if we're trying to figure out, say, Jewish attitudes toward a certain thing, we can ask those kinds of questions and then we can try to set them in context. I think the context is the most interesting part in many ways.
So as an academic, obviously, there's a way of sort of let's say a purist way of looking at some of these questions. And then obviously the Jewish community, various organs of the Jewish community, federations, funders, et cetera, are interested in these kinds of questions, partly to figure out what problems is the Jewish community facing and partly to figure out whether this or that intervention is working. And in a sense, I mean, education is clearly one of those. And you run a program in education. And we've been trying to think about, if you're studying whether education is working, what is it that we're trying to educate toward? And I know that one of the topics that comes up a lot is Jewish identity. And I know that that's something that you've thought a lot about and have concerns about the way that language is being used. But so I'd love for you to talk about that. And I'm also interested in you're talking about sort of any other factors that you think the Jewish community seems to be interested in. And maybe we're not quite looking at it correctly or not asking the right questions or not coming to the right conclusions, or that we are coming to the right questions and conclusions.
I'm dubious about the term identity. I think it's become kind of a sacred cow or a golden calf or some sort of metallic farm animal where people invest a lot in the concept of Jewish identity. It's good that we have strong Jewish identities, but I've been impressed for like the better part of a decade with the fact that Jewish identity is fine. People in America, young people in particular, are really happy to be Jewish. They're very proud to be Jewish. We can look at why that is historically. But I think the question about the sort of status of what a Jewish identity is, or the status of one's Jewish identity as a statement of how happy one is to be Jewish, that fight is over. 93% of American Jews are proud to be Jewish, according to the Pew Report. So when you have a return that high, it suggests that identity is just fine. Jewish identity is just fine in America. One of the interesting things about the Pew Report is the disparity between people's sense of Jewishness, which is quite high, and the ways in which they engage in Jewish communal life, which is not that high. So right there, it suggests that just measuring identity as a subjective expression of one's own sense of Jewishness is not a particularly useful measure. And I think I'm not the first person to say this. I was just reading some articles from the late 1960s and early 1970s, and a bunch of people from that period say identity can't be and this was just at the moment when identity was kind of coming into its own as a source of politics or as an educational outcome. And people were already at that point saying, don't double down on identity for identity's sake. It's not going to do the job. Most people didn't listen, to the point where now Jewish identity is so common in American Jewish communal language. It's so common in terms of educational missions that it's virtually, when I tell people that I try not to use the language of identity in my own research, they look at me as if I'm crazy, as if there was nothing else to study. And I find sometimes when you get terms like that are so laden and so sort of bloated with assumed meanings, that taking that away opens up new opportunities, new ways of thinking about the purposes of Jewish education, for example, or Jewish life. So I've tended recently to think about commitments, what it means to be committed to Jewish things, what it means to be committed to Jewish people. How might we measure the strength of commitment? How might we measure Jewish ideas or Jewish concepts, as opposed to just measuring Jewish identity, which ultimately boils down to counting people, which I also don't find that interesting.
Well, it seems this is something that we've been talking a lot about as we've been struggling with questions that have come up recently about intermarriage, but it's not only intermarriage. It's intermarriage is a part of the whole scene, but fundamentally it's some set of assumptions that seem to be not proving themselves out in a confusing way for the Jewish community, and there's a lot of Sturmdrang about this, right? And that somehow there's some maybe assumption that maybe from, back in the 60s when they were talking about it, an assumption that, well, if we cultivate a strong Jewish identity, that will result in marriage, and that will result in a next generation that has identity, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's some sense that, well, if that didn't work and there's a lot of intermarriage, that must not be producing people with strong Jewish identities. But the Pew study seems to indicate otherwise in many respects. And so, yes, on the one hand, that whole set of assumptions seems to be breaking down. And then but then the question is, like, when we look at things like commitments and ideas, I mean, what might be a better frame through which to look at the question that I think sort of fundamentally, I guess, the Jewish community is looking at, which is, I guess there's actually two dimensions of it. Number one, will Judaism as we know it thrive into the future? And number two is, if not, will there be some other form of Judaism that might be confusing to us, but will be nevertheless thriving, and maybe that could provide some consolation to some of these folks, and maybe it doesn't. But I'm curious if that's the direction that you think you're starting to look at, if you think we should be looking at how we might look there.
I'm not sure the phrase Judaism as we know it is right enough, because I don't know that we know what Judaism is as we know it, or Jewishness is as we know it. That is to say, when you have really in the same 2-week period Stephen Cohen and Sylvia Barrick-Fishman writing a report for the Jewish Peoplehood Policy Institute, essentially rehashing arguments that they've been making for the better part of a decade or longer about the dangers of Jewish families with non-Jews in them. And then you also have Amichai Lau-Levi and Rolly Madelon, two leaders of conservative Jewry in a certain way, coming out and saying that they're going to begin to perform marriages between Jews and non-Jews. It's really hard to say what Jewishness is. Is Jewishness a kind of set of ideals that are prescribed upon people, or should we be looking at the ways in which Jews really live their lives? And if we're looking at the latter, I'm more interested in the latter than I am in the former. And if we're looking at the ways in which Jews live their lives, and a lot of the prescriptions that have come out over the last 3 decades about the perils of intermarriage and the efforts to counteract that, if that's what you think is a reasonable response, they haven't panned out. We have an American Jewish community, certainly among non-Orthodox Jews, in which non-Jews figure prominently. They raise Jewish children, or they raise children who are engaged in Jewish life. They go to synagogue, they celebrate life cycle events together as parts of families and as members of communities. Those families are involved in celebrations of all kinds. And instead of looking at them as kind of lost, potentially lost members of the flock, right? There are ways in which they ought to, I think, thinking of them in terms of new forms, perhaps, of Jewish life that are emerging.
So then what is the fear that seems to be animating Sylvia Barrick-Fishman and Stephen M. Cohen's work? What is it that they're saying is not happening, or where is it that they seem to be saying that their fears about intermarriage are being borne out, even as I think we all agree, the three of us, that we're seeing a world in which the fears that we heard about, back in the 80s, whenever, that those aren't actually being borne out?
One way, and I'm increasingly convinced that this is what's happening, and I actually had an exchange with Stephen and a few other people kind of offline about this a couple of years ago, that they're effectively saying these poor Jews who marry non-Jews are they're making a bad choice from the perspective of the Jewish people in the abstract. Now, I'm not sure who the Jewish people are in the abstract other than Jewish people. And those same Jewish people are making all kinds of choices with which Stephen and Sylvia disagree. And I think that the prevailing attitude is a very gentle kind of paternalism. That is to say, these poor people, if only they understood what was really happening, then they would make a different choice. And in that way, the implicit undertone of that is that they're blaming those families for what Stephen and Sylvia understand to be the kind of collapse of the Jewish middle, to use Stephen's language, or just the collapse of the non-Orthodox American Jewish community. From where I sit, I find that troubling because I just find it an unreasonable expectation that a couple in which one partner is Jewish and one partner is not goes to a conservative synagogue, even if it's the conservative synagogue in which one of them grew up, and they say to the rabbi, "Can you marry us?" And the rabbi says no. Or they join as a family with children, and come the bar bat mitzvah of their child, the rabbi says, "You, one partner, can participate fully. You, other partner, cannot." I think it places an extraordinary responsibility, almost an unreasonable expectation on the shoulders of that family to say, "Oh, I know they don't think that we're equal parents in this, but we'll continue to be part of this community." That seems to me unreasonable. And it seems to me that if certain segments of the American Jewish community are wondering why people aren't turning up, they're not going to change. I don't think they're going to do much in the way of changing the attitudes of those people, but they could change their own policies.
I'd be curious to hear a little bit from you about some other big ticket terms in Jewish conversations, because the identity one is huge, as you've mentioned, but there's a few others as well that I'd love to get your take on. And maybe first among them is community, but also some related terms about, the Jewish collective in terms of peoplehood, but also ethnicity, which we haven't talked about so much on our show, but which I think actually plays deeply into conversations about intermarriage and also other important Jewish issues that we've talked about a little bit already, but also would love to explore the rest of the episode. So what do you make of Jewish ethnicity, and how does that connect to the work you've done on identity?
The prevailing notion among liberally religious or non-nominally religious American Jews is ethnicity. For how do we explain who Jews are? People are very uncomfortable with the language of race, as they should be. Ethnicity, I don't think actually gets us much further from race, but people seem to be more comfortable with it. It's kind of softer, so people are okay with it. But when I interview post-boomer American Jews, Generation X, Generation Y, millennials, ethnicity is not a term that resonates. I have an article coming out that I wrote with Tobin Belzer and a couple of my students that's coming out in the fall, in which we basically gave Gen X and Gen Y Jews kind of carte blanche. We gave them a lot of control over the direction of the interview and said, just tell me the story of your lives and let me know how Jewishness fits in there. And the way that they describe Jewishness, so one of the things they did was they gave us a lot of definitions of religion that they don't ascribe to and they were not interested in. Most of them describe themselves as being not religious in some fashion. And the other thing they did, so they voluntarily gave us those definitions. They avoided almost entirely the language of ethnicity. It's just not a concept that resonates with them. And the parts of Judaism that they wanted to retain were things that they identified as traditions. And tradition is a great concept because for them, it allowed them to connect to other Jews, both horizontally, kind of at the same time as a shared culture, and kind of vertically over time with their parents and grandparents and people who they imagined came before them. And it could be something as simple as a challah recipe or something as complicated as Shabbat dinner. But it was the traditions that mattered. And the other piece of traditions is traditions are non-exclusive. When you get to talking about ethnicity, one is forced necessarily to draw boundaries between who is in and who's out that ethnos. And the same problem is true, Lex, about communities, right? Somebody's got to be outside of the community for you to have an inside of the community. You can't have a community without boundaries. And ethnicity, because it has this sort of shimmer of race embedded in it, and the etymology of the term, the history of the term is the term emerged from a concern about how to explain what Jews were to people who are not Jewish without resorting to clannishness or religion. Horace Callan at Harvard was like the driver behind this. And he was concerned with what his non-Jewish classmates thought about him and his fellow Jews who were interested, really interested and passionate and deeply thoughtful about Jewish life, but had no interest in religion and didn't want to be classified as a race. So they promoted this notion of ethnicity as a kind of soft thing that was in between. It was neither here nor there. I think that ethnicity over time has become a little bit too ossified, and the language just doesn't land with younger post-boomer American Jews in my experience.
I'm really interested in your point about the word tradition, and just I like what you said, which is that tradition feels, and I certainly use it myself, and I'm in the millennial cohort, so it rings true. What I get nervous about with tradition is that it's a backwards looking kind of word, and I think that that's important. And we talk on the show all the time about how we need to ensure that elements of our Jewish past play a big and deep role in our present. But I think when the defining frame is tradition, we almost start to feel sometimes like we're in a museum and we're in this sort of preservation mindset of like keeping things from the past as opposed to figuring out new, exciting ways to live Jewishly today. And I have an inclination that that's not really what you're getting at with the term. But I guess I'm curious if you could unpack sort of some of the layers of tradition and how we might think about it in a way that meshes well with contemporary Judaism.
So just to be really clear, and this is actually, I think, the most interesting part of the study, tradition was not our language as investigators. We didn't ask our interviewees to tell us about tradition. We asked them to tell us about their lives. And what they told us about when they talked positively about Jewish life was tradition, and that was their language. More than half of our interviewees came up with that word and offered it as a way of describing their own positive encounters with Jewishness. So for me, that is interesting, and I don't think it's being overly semantic or kind of in the weeds of you say tomato, I say tomato kind of stuff, because clearly that's a term, the presence of that term and the absence of ethnicity in the interviews that we did suggests that the ways that the American Jewish and the rejection of religion by many of them suggests that the emphasis on ethnicity and the emphasis on religion are simply not part of the ways that younger Jews talk about their Jewish lives. Tradition is, and so at least in our study. And so for me, there is an element of backward looking to it, that is, one inherits traditions, but also tradition is a very human construct. Traditions are traditions because they are not handed down from on high. And actually, the lead-in to the song in Fiddler on the Roof is something like Tevye saying, you know, we have all these ways of doing stuff. Why do we do them? I don't know, but we have one word to describe how we do them, and it's tradition. And the traditions are traced not to a kind of adherence to a divine authority, but to a desire to do things with people. And a sense that if you're not doing it exactly by the book, it's okay. There's some breathing room there. And in that way, I think it is both looking back, but it has a kind of elasticity to it that allows people to engage in ways that are appealing and comfortable and that are meaningful to them.
When I hear that they're talking about tradition as being the key defining characteristic of their Judaism in your studies, you know, my concern and wish is like, oh, why don't they want to innovate more and create new Jewish stuff, you know, and that maybe that's what Lex was getting at with this question about the backward lookingness of it, you know, is like, is that all that this Judaism will be going forward, is some preservation of one kind or another? And I guess my question is, number one, do you think that's the case? And number two is, to the extent that we would like to see not only preservation, but also innovation and an ongoing renewal, Do you see evidence of that? Do you see evidence of sort of intervention, so to speak, that get people thinking in that direction? Do you think people don't think in that direction because they don't like that direction, or because maybe in their education, right, they've never considered that Judaism may be a avenue that's open to creativity? And I was struck by something that Shulam Dean said a few weeks ago when we interviewed him about his leaving ultra-Orthodoxy, and he noted to us that it wasn't necessarily the non-believers that leave ultra-Orthodoxy, it was the creative people that tend to leave ultra-Orthodoxy because it's not an environment that welcomes creativity. And I wonder if in a deeper way, people aren't associating Judaism with the creative impulse of renewal, but rather with a sort of preservationist impulse of one kind or another.
Well, I don't think that it's as stark as all that. Two things. One, not everybody can be an innovator. There just isn't an appetite for that. There isn't the capacity for that. Some people should innovate and some people should participate, and that's cool. The second thing that I would probably say is that I don't think it's as stark as like either preservation or innovation. Those two things are related to one another. They don't exist without each other. So you don't have preservation without a certain kind of innovation. Even if you imagine that you're doing exactly the same thing that your grandparents did or your parents did or you did last week, you're not doing exactly the same thing. You can't step in the same river twice, let alone with the passage of time and the frailties of human memory. You just don't get perfect preservation ever. Lex, you mentioned, the fear of museums, and Barbara Kirschen Black-Imlet is one of my teachers, colleagues, mentors, friends, whatever, has this great piece in one of her articles about museums. It's like, well, how much culture do you need to preserve culture in a museum? Let's say you have a coffee cup. Do you need the cup and the saucer? Do you need the tea in the cup? Do you need the table on which the cup is sat, and so on and so forth? Representing culture perfectly can't happen without the totality of the culture in which that artifact sits. It's not a matter of either innovation or preservation. Those things are always dynamically tied to one another.
When we think about the way, for example, that boomers are looking at Judaism versus the way that, let's say, Gen X or millennials are looking at Judaism, I suppose the question is whether the Judaism that the boomers are sort of defining as the Judaism that's worthy of preservation was, in your view, merely one blip on the way that Judaism has been throughout history and is of no more or no less significance than any other form of Judaism that there might be, and therefore that way of thinking about it is just wrong?
Well, I also want to hesitate to draw such a sharp distinction between boomers and post-boomers, because there are members of both of those communities who think like members of the other community. So I don't think it's precisely generational. I think it's generally generational, but not precisely so. I think every generation, and God willing, the earth should be here in 20 years or 50 years. So I'm an old enough man to look at the next generation and tell them they're full of shit. But they're going to come along and they're going to say, you're full of shit. And that's just the way, like, that kind of generational change is just what happens. I've been reading, as it happens, a lot about the late 1960s and early 1970s, which is precisely the time when baby boomers were coming of age. And the generation just prior to them, the people who were then leaders of the American Jewish community, were obsessed with what was happening on college campuses. They were obsessed with the Jewish lives of college students. They were petrified that the Jews who were members of the New Left, sort of the popular and flexible, kind of liberal, countercultural-ish political scene on college campuses in the late 1960s, they were terrified that the Jews who were members of the New Left were fighting too universalist a battle and weren't attending to their own Jewish souls enough. And then the Jewish radicals came along, and some of them were skeptical of the Jewish radicals because they were changing Jewishness too quickly. And they began to speak very actively and very frequently about survival. And that's the same rhetoric that is being kicked around now with respect to the future of the Jewish people. The demographic question isn't a question that drives me. One of the most interesting analyses of the 2013 Pew study was by Ted Sasson, who said, well, you're seeing a lot of people identify as Jewish now who have one Jewish parent, and a generation ago you probably wouldn't have seen that. So you're getting changes in the demography of the Jewish of the Jewish community, Lex, I apologize, but you're seeing changes in the demography of American Jewish population, not based on anything other than people claiming an affinity for being Jewish, and who gets to do that and how and why changes over time.
While we're talking about people being petrified intergenerationally, especially petrified of elements of the left, I figure we might as well jump into Israel. Seems too easy, too relevant. We couldn't possibly resist. And I know that you've written about this and studied this a little bit in terms of American Jews and their relationships to Israel, the extent to which they're changing, the extent to which they're not. I guess just sort of open-ended, what would you say about the current place of Israel in Jewish discourse and Jewish life, and to what extent are there significant changes happening to those realities?
I'm in the middle of a project right now with my students where we're looking at American Jewish college students and how they make sense of politics on their campuses. We're looking at students on 4 or 5 California campuses, anti-Semitism, Israel, Palestine, Black Lives Matter, and so on. And keep your eyes peeled. We should have a report by the end of the summer, just as people are ready to go back to school. But it's a little too early to tell what the findings are.
In a sense, the question that I'm curious about is, how should those of us who are thinking about the Jewish community or the Jewish world, whatever we want to call it, how should we be thinking about this relationship between Jews in America and Israel? What are the right questions to be asking, or what is the right window to be looking through?
I have no idea, Dan. I don't even have an appropriate question to ask Americans about how they feel about living in America nowadays. And I hold no grudges about anybody who advances an argument that says, I'm done with that conversation. It seems much easier to do for American Jews about Israel than it would be for any American to do about America, because we're citizens. I'm a citizen of this country. We're citizens of this country. I vote. I pay taxes. I will live in all likelihood with the repercussions of what's happening today. None of those things are true for me with respect to Israel. I don't vote. I'm not a citizen. I don't pay taxes. I didn't serve in the IDF. I don't live there. And so it feels quite distant. And for people who are even less connected to Israel than I am, what Israel does, how Israel behaves towards its own citizens and towards Palestinians who are not citizens of Israel, but over whom Israel rules, it becomes increasingly difficult to be sympathetic to the responses that they seem to make. And then you pile on top of that stuff like the Western Wall deal, when the government of Israel basically reneged on an agreement to provide an egalitarian prayer space at the Western Wall, and American Jews freaked out about that. And my response is, I have almost stopped to expect Israel to care very much about what American Jews think or do. And so for me, I was not surprised by that development in Israel. And the one upshot of that is that when things like that happen, or when Israel continues to build settlements on the West Bank, it becomes very difficult for people living in a time when it feels like, when people feel politically disempowered, to get up the energy to engage in a political discussion in a foreign country. Most of us don't speak the language there, in which the decisions that are made by that government seem to go routinely against the values that many Americans hold. So I do not at all find it problematic that American Jews are increasingly unwilling to talk about Israel or unwilling to engage in Israel about any of these things. It makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, it's kind of a fascinating situation, I think, actually, in light of the beginning part of our conversation, because I'm thinking about Israel. It's actually an interesting example, right, of a dimension of being Jewish that is talked about very much as if to think about it differently from the way that we've been thinking about it for the last 50, 60, 70 years, whatever, would be some kind of betrayal of Judaism. And yet we know that Israel only came into existence during that period. And so it's less that I want to focus on the conversation about Israel in this question, but more sort of as an example of one of many dimensions of Judaism that were sort of formed, let's say, in the mid part of the 20th century, and then seem to be unraveling in terms of the way that 21st century Jews are thinking about them as compared to the way that their forebears, only a generation or two ago were thinking about them. And I'm wondering whether seeing that happen so dramatically with Israel is also a useful lens through which to see the relationships to Judaism altogether.
The terrain on which American Jewish life has been built is shifting dramatically. There's no real reason to expect, especially given how quickly things change in the geopolitical context, that's going to remain the same. The pride that people felt, that American Jews felt by and large, with the founding of the state or with Israel's military victory in 1967, can't possibly hold in the same way for people who were born in the 21st century or late in the 20th century. It's impossible. And I'm not saying, and I don't think that's qualitatively a bad thing. I think it's just the nature of the beast when it comes to the vectors along which American Jews understand what it means to be Jewish.
I'm curious a little bit. This may seem like a little bit of a leap to a new conversation, but here goes anyway. It's come up a little bit here and there about intermarriage and just looking at the ways in which we've talked about the ways in which generationally there are differences in worldviews, and also the ways that generationally we actually may be closer than we think. Intermarriage, just looking at numbers over the last 100 years, you can see drastic shifts happening there. And I guess in terms of sort of coming full circle and revisiting this issue of identity that we started off with, what does the rise in intermarriage and the accompanying rise in people who are children of intermarriage actually continuing to be a part of Jewish life, what does that do to conceptions of what it means to be Jewish? None of us has our crystal ball and can see the future, but to the extent that affects what you term our commitments or our traditions, if you had to do a little bit of futurology or even just presentology, whatever, how is that affecting the Jewish world in which we live?
So first of all, we are moving from a conception of a Jewish community that is exclusively comprised of Jewish people to one that is more diverse. And I don't mean that we have African-American Jews and Jews of Asian descent and so on. I mean, we have non-Jews in the Jewish community. And American Jewish organizations better get on board with what it is to minister to those people, or they're going to be very quickly not ministering to the vast majority of American Jews. American Jewish families. They're going to be communal organizations without a community. For Jewish education, it means thinking about how to teach or make available the wisdom that is embedded in the vast tradition of Jewish cultural production, whether it's literature or sacred texts or art or music or whatever, however you want to define those. And I have very, very sort of porous boundaries around that. It means making them available to whoever wants them. I don't think that Jews need to be the exclusive bearers of Jewish wisdom. That seems ridiculous to me. And the flip side of that is you can't assume that because people are Jewish, they're going to turn up to stuff that's Jewish. So the delivery mechanisms for Jewish wisdom or Jewish ideas or Jewish culture or Jewish engagement or meaningful Jewish rituals they're going to change. That's about the best futurology that I can give. I apologize for being vague, but they're going to change in response to the changing makeup of the American Jewish community, of the ways in which American Jews identify and desire to engage with Jewish life in some capacity or build Jewish lives in some way. It's just not exclusive to Jews. And either you're going to take a position, I think, like Amichai Levi or Roli Madelon, and say, we're going to welcome those families into our community, or you're going to take a position like JTS the Jewish Theological Seminary, which issued a statement in support of its already existing ban on marriages between Jews and non-Jews. And you'll say, we cannot condone your family. One of those, I think, has a stronger perspective on a future. One of those, I think, does not.
I think that some of the story that you're describing too about the conservative movement's sort of institutional perspective here is really just sort of a mismatch between who the institutional leadership of the conservative movement thinks conservative Judaism is and what the people think conservative Judaism is. And something like this actually sort of reveals that there is this mismatch, and who's right and who's wrong is, I think, a really interesting question. And I could see it, being discussed in different ways. But fundamentally, I think it does sort of raise this ultimate question, which I think is that if we're talking about somebody who wants to, who's concerned, who not concerned in a fearful way, but concerned in a way that says, hey, I want to make a difference for the Jewish future, and I want to contribute what I have to contribute. So the easy way to think about that is from the perspective of a funder, but I think it also probably has to do with the perspective of various people, various institutions, and they're saying, right, if I'm wanting to invest my capital into this project of the Jewish future, how do I judge whether I'm getting a return on my investment? What does it look like to get a return on my investment if what you're telling me is that the future is going to be very different from the past? So what is it that we can, quote, buy, with our investment? And how should we be studying whether we invested our resources well and maybe didn't get what we already know, but we got something good versus we got something bad? I mean, how do we look at those questions?
I should say first that it's possible that both JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and the rabbis who've graduated from that institution who are now committing to performing marriages between Jews and non-Jews are right. It's possible that they are both right, and they should both live long. I have no beef with JTS. I have no desire to see it collapse. I think American Jewry is stronger if it survives, along with all kinds of other institutions that reflect the breadth and diversity of American Jewish life. So I want to be really clear that I don't think JTS should be just shuttered at all. But that goes to the answer to your second part of the question, which is there isn't one Jewish future. There's going to be lots of Jewish futures. And so if a prospective philanthropist knocked on my door and said, I want to make sure that I get a return on my investment, and I care about the Jewish future, I would want to know from that person a lot more about what part of the Jewish future they want to see happen, and then how to help them bet on the right horse. Because if they want a Jewish future in which conservative Judaism holds to standards that it's held to for the last, since it's been around, they should give their money to JTS, and they should hope that their money is able to move that needle in the direction that they wish. If they want the conservative movement or conservative Jews, or if they want to create a new movement in Jewish America that sort of lands between conservative and reform, then they should probably invest in the people and burgeoning institutions that seem to be occupying that space now. But they're going to be different futures.
I really want to hold and highlight the point you made about Jewish space or Jewish organization not meaning organization that serves just Jews, and that even Jewish family can refer to a group of people that includes some non-Jews, or not even that includes Christians, or that includes Muslims or Buddhists or humanists or nothings, whatever it might be. Because I think that shift, it's not even that people are against it so much. It's that people haven't really even started to internalize the depth of what that means. For me, I had a fascinating experience this past Passover, because my fiance and I, and she's not Jewish, we hosted a Seder on the fifth night. It wasn't one of the first two nights. So already we're breaking with when you would typically do a Seder. But we had a Seder, and there were 3 people there who were Jewish and 10 who weren't. And there were Jewish people I could have invited, but we actually wanted, for purposes of that evening, to have mostly people who were not Jewish there. And the reason for that isn't because I don't like Jews. It was, but it's because actually there is something really powerful happening in society right now, or over the last few decades maybe, and people talk about this. People say, oh, it used to be that that Christians or others wouldn't even think about marrying Jews, and now they are willing to. For me, it's not even that they're now willing to tolerate Jews. That's true, and that's one level of it. But we've got a ton of people that are fascinated and excited actively about Jewish stuff. This Seder, every 5 minutes, it was exactly what a Seder is supposed to be. It's all about questions and people interrupting and asking what's going on and what's this symbolize. It was happening the entire way through. And I think that just recognizing that this is a really cool new thing, that for maybe not the only time in history, but the first time in a while, the last few centuries, incredible numbers of non-Jews are actively interested in participating in Jewish life. So I guess just as we arc towards the close, I was wondering if you could comment just on that whole question of what it means for people who are not Jewish to take part in Jewish life, even if they're not intermarried, if they're just, friends or acquaintances with some Jews.
It's just the way the world is now in the United States. Diversity, multiculturalism, pluralism, intersectionality are taken. They are the air we breathe. I've heard stories, Lex, like the one you just told, from tons of people, often as they're remembering very far, their best Passover was not the one where we sat around the table and read page after page of the Haggadah, but was the one where it was a more interactive, more discursive, more engaged conversation between people who knew stuff and people who didn't, Jewish, non-Jewish, whatever. And so I'm not surprised by that. And so it doesn't make sense to me that one would, especially if you believe firmly in the wisdom of certain elements of the Jewish tradition, why one would want to kind of hide it or cloister it, especially if our peer groups, our families, our colleagues, our networks are increasingly diverse along a variety of axes. If our communities are diverse, then our celebrations should be diverse, and the people we celebrate with should be diverse. I'm finishing a book about B'nai Mitzvah that I wrote with my students, and so I went to a bunch of B'nai Mitzvah for a while. But what I heard was from the kids we interviewed and from other people, this is the one time where Jewishness is cool to their non-Jewish friends. So I sat with the kids in synagogue, and there's 40 of them. They have no idea what's going on, and 30 of them are not Jewish. And the 10 Jews, it's not like 10 Jewish kids know what's going on, but the whole crew doesn't know what's going on, but they understand that this is a big day for their friend, and they're showing up and they're in the synagogue. And the kid who's friends with all these people, because they go to public school, they go to private school, whatever, they want to celebrate this moment with their friends. Who are their friends? Their friends are African American and Latino. Their friends are Asian and Catholic and Buddhist and whatever. And why would we want those friendship networks that are diverse, that we value as, I think, 21st century Americans, why would we want them to win out? Why would we not want to open our own celebrations and rituals to the people with whom we share our lives?
Well, it's a great note to end on. So, Ari, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to talk to you both.
Thanks again to Ari Kelman for joining us for this episode, and thanks again to all of you out there for listening. It means a lot to us that you tuned in. So we want to close out the episode in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a few ways for you to do that. First, you can always head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can check out our website, judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, you can hit us up via email at dan@nextjewishfuture.org or lex@nextjewishfuture.org. The last plug we like to make is that you can always support us with a financial donation of any amount, and you can do that at www.judaismunbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.